When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadabji, your podcast host, a practicing social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 50. She healed a horrifying childhood and transformed it into a beautiful gift. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our courageous and daring guest, Melissa Maloney. Melissa has dedicated her career to supporting teams and driving a highly engaged and successful workforce. She knows what it takes to go from an idea in a leader's mind to execution on the front line. Melissa has spent over 20 years as a sales and operations executive with a focus on health, wellness, and employee well-being. She is the founder of Happy Leader Enterprises and the co-founder of All Women Lead. Melissa developed a passion for helping others find happiness at a young age and now helps leaders to do the same. With a focus on productivity, leading with emotional intelligence, and creating a culture where everybody wins, she will ensure you leave every engagement with actions you can implement tomorrow. Melissa is a sought-after speaker and a best-selling author who was named one of the top 20 under 40 in 2018 by London Incorporated magazine and named as top 50 visionary for 2019 by Radical Business magazine. Hi, Melissa. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. What about yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you.
That's amazing. Melissa, I'm so happy. I'm really quite happy to have you on the show today, and I'm undoubtedly appreciative for your willingness to tell your story. You know, I continue to be inspired to connect with guests who allow me to draw from their strength and support and inspiration, from all the stories that are shared here. So it's really important that we take a stance together to help break those barriers of mental stigma.
Definitely. I think it's such a critical thing for us to be having the conversation about right now.
Critical conversations is exactly it. And in case you're still wondering, you may or may not be, but this podcast, it's really all about bringing forward those untold stories that people go through, whether it's directly about a mental health struggle or something else. And we know that no matter what person's story is, whatever the individual story is, there is impact on one's own mental well-being in some way. And that's the part that typically remains tucked away during any kind of sharing. So this platform serves in a way to break those barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So today, together, my hopeful mission is for you and I to stand tall and encourage people to share and tell what people typically have reservations for expressing. And so I've been bringing forward a trend, and it's called the mental beauty rethink. Melissa, let me ask you, what comes to mind when you take in those words, the mental beauty rethink?
I think it's such a great way to describe it because when we think about trying to eliminate the stigma, when we
Mm-hmm.
use even the word wellness, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
still, you still put the opposite to it, where you're like, oh, that
Mm-hmm.
means some people are unwell. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
when we start to completely change the language around it to mental beauty, it really,
Mm-hmm.
to me, just shows the positive side of all of it, and that it, because anything can be beautiful. So to me, it's hopeful and creates possibility.
Mm. Creates possibility. Yeah, that transformation from wellness to beauty. Yeah, I also see it as like this way of neutralizing the separation between physical health and mental health and having them merge, right? So when you hear the words physical health, in our minds, it's pretty neutral. And when you say mental health, it doesn't quite register the same for many. So I like how you've described it as, from wellness to beauty and really creating a positive shift.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's a beautiful way to describe it. So I like
Mhm.
it.
I appreciate that. Thank you. It's meaningful to hear your perspective. So, Melissa, I'm ready to rock and roll. How about you?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. All right, Melissa, give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. How would it read?
It would read, "Happiness is a choice."
Happiness is a choice. All right, so that's interesting. What does this headline mean to you?
I think as we explore my story today, you'll
Hmm.
see themes that include ownership and choosing of an attitude and a perspective that I hope people can find some level of inspiration through, just
Hmm.
knowing that we ultimately have the power and control to get to the destination we want to get to and to find that happiness, joy, and fulfillment in life. And everything I do is really about driving people to that feeling of ownership and helping them
Hmm.
understand the possibilities.
Hmm. Hmm. It sounds very rich. Like, happiness is a choice, very simple words, but there's so much to unpack there. And so I'm so eager to get started in hearing all about your untold story. So let's do that. Give us the skinny. What's it all about?
For sure, it's a hard story to tell because it does
Hmm.
take place over a pretty significant period of time. Ultimately, I always say I didn't have the ideal childhood, so it's kind of started. I don't have a lot of memories before the age of 8, but I have sort of flashes. And so
Hmm.
one of my first memories that I remember is the night that my dad left our home, and
Hmm.
when it was
Hmm.
just my sister and my mom and I. But I
Hmm.
remember hearing them fighting, and I
Hmm.
remember hearing a really loud bang. And
Hmm.
the next day, when I woke up, my dad was gone. And we
Hmm.
had one of those old, like, butcher block cutting boards, and it was smashed
Hmm.
in half on the counter. And
Oh,
that's one of the very first things that I remember. That's one of my very first memories. And I would have been about 3. And
wow.
we didn't have a close relationship with my dad after that point for a number of years. And if we sort of fast forward to when I was 8, my mom was
Hmm.
diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer.
Hmm.
And it was
Oh,
at that
wow.
point that my dad sort of resurfaced into our lives more consistently, was
Hmm.
once my mom was sick.
Okay.
Yeah. So mom got sick. She was diagnosed in January, passed away in September, was pretty much hospitalized
Hmm.
almost that whole time. It
Hmm.
hit hard
Hmm.
and fast.
Yeah.
And then after we lost mom, we went back to living with my dad and my stepmom, and that's when I would say the big experiences started. My dad was an alcoholic, sadly, till the day he died. And alcohol led him to do bad things. He was quite angry. He was violent. He
Mhm.
said really harsh things, and there was a lot
Mhm.
of of abuse that
Mhm.
happened over the next number of years. And my dad had been a police officer. He was off the force at that point, and I had called the police a couple times when he was angry, and the police would come to our house, and we would get oh, I understand what it's like when you get a domestic call, officer, sorry about that. And then people would
Mhm.
leave. So it really built this feeling that people weren't there to help us with what was going on.
That there was no help. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Oh,
so my dad did some pretty horrific things physically to both my stepmom and my sister. And I always say I don't feel like I got the worst of the physical. I got I
mhm.
got more of the emotional stuff. So I got spanked. I got things that again
So
I've
there was,
always kind of minimized.
yes, there was some physical, but I think what you're saying is that in comparison to what your stepmom and sister endured, it was much milder.
Yeah, exactly. And
Okay.
mine was more, it was more emotional. It was a lot more manipulative. I would say probably one of my worst memories was there was a night when I wouldn't eat dinner, and I got sent to my room. So off I went because that's just what you did.
Mhm.
And I don't know why that night was different. I don't know what was happening. And he came into my room with 2 cans of tuna and opened up the cans of tuna and poured them all over me. And then
Oh my goodness.
wouldn't let me get out of bed. And so I slept like that. And finally, the next day, I was allowed to leave my room and change and do that. So it was things like that where
Right.
it was more demeaning
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and emotional than it was physical.
Right. That must have been such a difficult time to not know what to expect and when to expect it, and seemed like so many of the behaviors were so unpredictable.
Yeah, and I think as I've spent a lot of time in my adult life, sort of, I've read every adult Daughters of Alcoholics book and the
Mm.
impact. You really start to see some of the things that you do to cope, because
Right.
I really do believe children are probably some of the most um, resilient humans out there. But you develop
Mhm.
coping skills, and I developed the ability to compartmentalize. And so what happened at home
Mhm.
stayed at home. I walked out of the door and
Mhm.
I was a happy kid who went to school and
Mhm.
participated in extracurriculars and had friends and did all the things that you would expect any other nine
Right.
or 10 year old to do.
Right. So there was no chance for anyone to have even an inkling of, hmm, something is up there.
No, I don't think so. Like, I really don't think people
Mhm.
understood to the level that it was at. I think we all
Right.
functioned. We all did what we needed to do. It was just this was what we were experiencing behind closed doors when no one was around.
Mhm.
But I don't think most people knew what was happening.
Right. And so then what happened after age 9 or 10? Like, did things continue to worsen or did they continue to stay status quo?
They essentially continued in a similar vein until a few years later. I think I was 12. I had a suicide attempt at that point, and which kind of led me into the world of therapy.
At age 12? Oh my
Yeah,
goodness. Okay.
yeah,
Alright. And is that when you started therapy?
yeah. So that's when I started working with my first therapist
Okay.
and got some support. It was all sort of around that same time that my stepmom ended up leaving my dad. They had
Mhm.
my half brothers who were born when I
Mhm.
was 12. So my
Mhm.
stepmom, once my brothers were born, decided that she needed to go. She left not too long after my brothers were born, and then
Mhm.
my sister ended up staying with her and went with her, and I stayed with my dad. And
If it's okay for me to ask, who made those decisions for your sister to go with your stepmom and for you to remain with your father?
So my sister is older. So at that point, she would have been
Okay.
16. So
She made that decision.
yeah, she made that
Okay.
choice for herself. And for myself, when my stepmom and my dad started their separation and divorce proceedings, we were assigned a child advocate through the court. And when the
Okay.
child advocate asked me who I wanted to live with, I said neither of them, which apparently isn't an okay answer when you're
Uh-huh.
12.
Right.
I,
Okay.
I didn't see either of them as the right choice, so that meant I
Right.
stayed with my dad.
Okay. Okay. So that was the default of how you ended up staying with him.
Yeah, yeah, that's, I guess
Okay.
if you pick neither, they say your biological parent is the right choice then. So I stayed, and then truly I became like the wife of the house, for lack of a better way of putting it. I
Mm.
cooked, I cleaned. When the rent wasn't paid, I talked to the landlord about why it wasn't paid and dealt with all of those things and really did what needed to be done to make sure the household
Mhm.
was functioning.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that sort of continued. Again, my dad was still obviously heavily drinking at the time, and I got really
Right.
good at, my friends loved him. They thought he was a really fun guy. So I got good at, if he was drunk and kind of fell over and my friends were there, I would come up with a way to laugh it off and hide it so that
Mhm.
it wasn't,
So that no one would know.
and so yeah, no one would know.
Right.
And I just functioned. I look back now and I think about, obviously the teachers knew something was up with a 12-year-old with a suicide attempt. So I look back now and I'm like, it was obviously flagged at that point that something was probably
Right.
going on.
Right.
I think about grade 7, and I wrote a speech on abuse, which I'm going to assume most 13 and 14-year-olds don't do.
Right.
So I
Uh-huh.
think there were probably things that people saw and knew that as a
Mhm.
child, I didn't think people were onto it. But as an
Mhm.
adult, I'm like, oh no, there were definitely people who knew what was going on and just did what they
Mhm.
could.
Right. Right. And so then what happened after that? Did you just continue to live with your father as you opened up to your therapist? Was it a good fit? Were you able to make progress?
I definitely felt a lot of support. I did individual therapy with a woman named Lisa, and then they put me into some group sessions. I didn't stay in the group sessions very long because I was so busy helping everybody else. They told me it wasn't super
Right.
effective. Um, so when I was 14, I wanted out of my dad's house, and I was
Mhm.
really struggling with the continued emotional abuse, and being told I was useless and being told I'd never amount to anything, and those
Mm,
things all
mm.
the time. And so when I was at my therapist one day, she told me that she was concerned for my safety, that she was worried that, she said that I was worse then than I was when she had first met me,
Wow.
and was concerned. At that point, I had called Children's Aid myself, and
Mhm.
they told me that since I wasn't being physically abused, there wasn't that much that they could do.
They couldn't do anything.
Yeah, and it's
Mhm.
obviously it's a bit of a different time now than it was then.
And so wait a second, you're telling me that your therapist at age 14 had more concerns for your well-being than when she started with you when you had the suicide attempt?
Yes.
So she felt there was that much more concern.
Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah, yeah.
goodness.
She
Okay.
was really worried. I, at that point, had gotten to the point where I was standing in front of my dad, essentially
Mhm.
egging him on to hit me, because in my head I thought that's how I'd get out.
Right. So if you provoked him to hit you, then that was the way to be like, okay, well, now I can call Children's Aid and say he hit me.
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
it's amazing how a 14-year-old brain works. But yeah,
Well, it's the
that's
survival mode, right? It's like, how can I get out of this? And so you'll think about just about anything. And so when you would provoke him, how would he respond?
there was no reaction to it. As I've spent time over the years, sort of talking about it with therapists and working through the challenges of it,
Mhm.
I don't have a lot of memories of my mom. But
Mm-hmm.
the way they describe her and speak of her is that she was quite soft spoken and really kind and just like a really good person. And I'm told a lot. I look exactly like my mom, and I'm told a lot that I
Mm.
remind people of her.
Right.
Um,
People love her.
but I think the one quality that I got from my dad is I'm a pretty vocal person. I always say I'm a bit of a loudmouth.
Okay.
That was more of my dad. Like my dad, my
Mm-hmm.
dad was the outspoken person, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that was the quality that I got from him. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that quality was partially what that led everything. Like it led me to call the police. It led me to stand up to him. It led to all
Mm-hmm.
those things. But I
Mm-hmm.
also think he understood that I was the one who would follow through on getting him in trouble.
Right. So he had to resist.
Yeah.
And you did mention earlier you identified with saying like you became the wife of the home, but essentially the housekeeper, right? Like the
Mhm.
person who keeps the entire household in check. So you were an asset to the home. So if you weren't there, then he would lose out
Definitely.
on that.
Yeah. He liked to put up a good front, right? Like, and so
Mm-hmm.
my leaving would have changed that
Mm-hmm.
image.
Mm, right.
So I think there was pieces of that there as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, none of it makes me think that it was because he wanted me there. I've never I've never thought that. I've never had that
Right.
feeling that that's what it was.
Yeah. So there was this image that he had to maintain.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so for sure. And yeah, so when I ended up leaving, I
Mhm.
left when I was 14. I
So you
packed.
did leave.
Yep, I packed packed a
Mhm.
couple of garbage bags full of clothes. My aunt lived
Mhm.
about a 5-minute walk away, and I walked to my aunt's house. I left either on a Thursday or a Friday. It was definitely a weekend. And my dad didn't call my aunt's house until the Sunday to see if she knew where I was. So at that point, she said I was with her,
Wow. Mhm.
and I said I wasn't coming home. And that was kind of the end of it. There was a bit of a conversation, but I said I'm not coming back, and that was kind of where it was left.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the next couple of years, I stayed with my aunt for close to a year, but she's quite a bit younger than my dad was. So she was just starting a family, and there wasn't really space for me. And she had her first baby and things like that. So I was like, okay, it's time for me to go. So I left my aunt's
Mhm.
place, ended up at my sister's for a little while with her and her then boyfriend who she had moved in with. And so I was with them for a little while, but it didn't really fit like my healing journey and where I was at that time. So,
Right. Right.
and it also meant I switched cities, which I wasn't super happy about. So I ended up back to where I grew up and into my own community. And from the time I was probably at that point 15, close to 16, I pretty much worked full time and rented rooms, sometimes from people who I knew. And by the time I was 17, I had a friend of mine. Her and I had an actual apartment. And
Okay.
I just, again, just continued to function. I worked pretty much full time. I went to school full time. I was still a straight A
Right.
student. I did what I
Mhm.
had to do to survive.
Mhm. So tell me about this coping strategy, this idea of I just had to do it. I just did it. Because we know now that while it was your driving force, it is kind of maladaptive, right? So tell me more
Mhm.
about this coping strategy, how it evolved or how it came to surface for you or how it served you. Like tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't really know where it came from. But from the
Okay.
second that I left my dad's house, I had a
Mhm.
vision that I was going to be super successful and that I was going to run into
Mm.
him on the street one day
Mhm.
and that I
Mhm.
was going to be able to look at him and say, I did all of this without you. I didn't need you.
Mhm.
And it was almost like that became my driving force where I was
Mhm.
just like, no, I don't have to live that life. I can have better than that life. And
Mm.
just kept doing what I needed to do to survive. Now I realize I still overcompensate with independence when times get tough,
Right.
and I have a
Mhm.
hard time letting people in because my default mode
Mhm.
is I'll just get it done. But I was so determined to not be
Mm-hmm.
a victim of my circumstances that
Mm-hmm.
I just pushed through and I just
Right.
did what I needed to do. I don't know to this day which of my friends knew what was happening and which ones didn't. Nobody seemed to question why I didn't live at home. It just it
Mm-hmm.
just didn't, and nobody seemed to question it.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course when I was
Mm-hmm.
17, 18, everyone loved it because I had an apartment.
Yeah.
It was great.
You had a place for people to come and hang out at,
Yeah,
right? And have
exactly.
freedom from their homes. Right.
Exactly. So I graduated from high school, got into college, started college,
Mm-hmm.
and I just kept doing the steps of life that in my head would lead to success, that would lead to being able to prove him wrong, that would lead to being able to
Mm-hmm.
prove that all of the things that I've been called and told and everything else, that they weren't true.
That was your mission.
That was my mission. And
Yeah.
when I was 18, I had
Mm-hmm.
gotten really frustrated with the fact that my dad, he called me and asked me for money one day. He needed money. I was 18,
Okay.
I was in college. I I was working, I was
Mm-hmm.
fighting to do what I needed
Mm-hmm.
to do. And the day he called me and asked me for money was sort of like the tipping point. I was like, are you kidding
Mm-hmm.
me right now? And so
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
wrote him a letter that said, I need you to acknowledge what you've done to us. I need you to apologize for it and take responsibility for it. And if you can't do that, then sorry, I can't have you in my life. It's not serving me to have you. And
Mm-hmm.
I read the letter to my aunt and I said, what do you think? And she looked at me and she said, you know, if you send this, the risk is you're never going to hear from him again. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
yep. And she said, if you're okay with that, then seal it with a kiss and send it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
I did. And that was pretty much the last time I talked to him until he was essentially close to death.
Right. How did it feel to know that you were making this decision that had this possible outcome? It seems that you were ready for the outcome.
Yeah, I think I saw a therapist all through my teenage years as well. And
Mm-hmm.
I think I recognized that I was trying to heal and I was trying to
Mm-hmm.
be okay and that I was
Mm-hmm.
never going to be okay if I had to live in a world of denial. And
Mm-hmm.
if he never took the ownership for what he did and never took the responsibility, that would not help me move forward. And it made more
Mm-hmm.
sense to me to take that control and put myself in a position to move forward than to
Mm-hmm.
continue to have him let me down over and over and over again. It was kind of like
Mm-hmm.
that analogy of like when you get hit with a whole bunch of darts, it's way harder than when you just get hit with like one big bomb. And
Right.
like those constant darts just wear you down.
Right. And you needed to take that control back too. And I think what I'm hearing what you were doing at the time was that, because I mean, I often tell people one of the things that comes up sometimes in the sessions is like, if you expect someone to show up in your life in a certain way, you need to give them the opportunity to know that that's the way you expect them to show up. Now, they may or may not be able to fulfill your expectation, but the onus is on you to let them know. So it sounds like that's what you were doing. And you were recognizing that I'm going to take control of the situation here and ask for my needs, ask for what I want, ask for what is good for me. And if he gives it to me, that's great. And if he doesn't, I know what's good for me. And then if he's not good for me, it's not good for me. And it sounds, maybe I've got it wrong, but it sounds like that's where you're at, where you were at the time.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was just I just couldn't handle the letdowns anymore. So I needed to
Yeah.
move past them.
Yeah. You need to lay it all down and go, here's where I'm at. This is what it's all about. And I don't want to take this on anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't want to be there anymore. I was moving forward in my life. I was doing the work that I needed to do and it was time
Mm-hmm.
to move on. And so I did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That shows an incredible amount of strength and bravery at a very tender time, in your like late teens and early adulthood and with everything else that had been part of your journey. That must have been a really, really big step for you.
Yeah, it was. And I think it was the piece that I needed to do, and it sort of continued to push that message forward that I had in my head, that I was going to be successful in spite of him, and I was going to do what I needed to do. And so it was about the same time that I was starting college. So I initially went to school for child and youth work. I worked in group homes and worked with teenage girls who needed support. And so I just pushed through and did what I needed to do to get there. I took some of those learnings and lessons into my work when I started working with other kids who needed support and who were in need and who had struggles and family crises and things like that. I took that same sort of mentality of, you have the power to control this. Don't let it control you. And even then, very young, I was probably 21. I had such a belief that if you woke up every day and you were doing things that didn't make you happy, why would you keep doing them? And I so clearly remember so many conversations with the young women at the group home, talking to them about that. I'm like, you have control of this. Do the things that make you happy. And it was just always there for me. That sort of, the goal was happiness.
Yes. Yes. And so, Melissa, sometimes, when people come to see me for therapy, individuals are typically in one of three places. Sometimes people are getting started, some are in the middle, some are looking back. What part of the journey would you say that you're in? Are you getting started, in the middle, or looking back?
I would say a little bit of both. So I think when it comes to stuff with my dad, I feel like that a lot of that stuff is looking back. I think, though, in my early 30s, I had started to experience some anxiety. It was around the time when my kids were little, and I didn't have the ability to control life the way that I had been. And so at that point in time, I was seeing a therapist, and she had diagnosed me as having PTSD. And it was a big awakening for me in a lot of ways. And so I think when I look at sort of that, my journey with PTSD and where I'm at with that, I would say I'm still in the middle of it. I'm still learning. I'm still developing coping strategies. I'm still understanding what triggers me and what doesn't, and really recognizing and working my way through that still, I would say, almost every single day.
Okay, that's a fair assessment. It seems like you've really been reflecting on this for a while and you're aware of your own process. And that's really important to have that level of self-awareness. Okay, so I'm curious about how your untold story has affected your mental health. Now, I know that we just unfolded this part about the PTSD and that the intensity of the anxiousness that started to creep up on you. Tell me more about that. What sort of toll did you notice that it took on you? How did it show up or manifest?
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to get introduced to a therapist who had a lot of experience with working with patients with PTSD, which is where the diagnosis came from. And she was involved in doing both EMDR therapy and tapping therapy, which are both obviously common PTSD.
Yes, they're modalities of treatments for trauma. Yes, trauma treatment.
So she had done that. So when we started with the EMDR, the experience that I went through, I think it's probably the same for everybody, is I had to start to sort of just tell her my story from start to finish. And she identified things within that story that in her world would be like traumas. So the tuna story, the waking up to the cutting board, like those were sort of all the same sort of marking points that I had given to her.
Yes.
And then she was having me rate them. So scale of 1 to 10, how traumatic is this for you? Or how much emotion does this bring up for you? And rating them. And so when we got to my mom dying when I was 8, she said, this is obviously one of the biggest traumas in your life. And I was like, no, people die. And and she was like, no, like you lost your mom as a child. Like that's traumatic. And I was like, no, people die. So I was probably, at this point, I'm probably 32, 33. Like I'm very much an adult.
You're very much an adult. You're in your 30s and this is your way of processing it. You're like, what do you mean? Like,
yeah,
you had minimized it so much. You really packed it in there. Was really
100%.
surprised.
Yeah.
Right.
So I call my sister, who is 4 years
Mhm.
older than me. So now she's even more of an adult. And I call my sister and I
Mhm.
said, "Hey, do you think that mom dying was traumatic on us?" And
Mhm.
her response was, "No, people die." And I started laughing.
Same with
And
her.
I was like, "Just so you know, that's the wrong answer, apparently. I don't think that's what we're supposed to say." And we had
Mhm.
this whole conversation because we were both
Mhm.
just so convinced that people die. And why
Right.
would the loss of our mom have had the impact on us that it obviously did? But we
Mhm.
had both just continued life the way we thought we were supposed to. So then one day we were tapping,
Mhm.
and in tapping, you repeat what they tell you to repeat.
Yes.
One of the things she said is, "Even though I am a victim, I'm still okay." Something along those lines. And
Mhm.
I couldn't say it. I physically
Mm.
could not get the word victim to come out of my mouth. And
Wow.
obviously, I was almost instantaneously in tears. My chest was heavy. My
Mm.
stomach was tight. Like I was having a physical response to the word victim.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and I was like, "I'm not a victim." And she was like,
Mhm. Mhm.
"Yes, you are. You were
Mhm.
abused badly. You witnessed abuse.
Mhm.
You witnessed these horrific things. You 100% are a victim." And I was like, "No, I'm not. I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim." And she just kept pushing it. And by the end of that session, I could say the words, "I am a victim." And it was
Mm.
a physical weight lifted off my body. And it was
Wow.
like all of this anxiety and overwhelm and everything, it was almost like it disappeared in that session.
Such a cathartic release. Wow, like your body was holding on to so much.
It was this physical change, but then it
Mhm.
led to this, okay, what do I do with this now? And so
Right.
I actively continued like working through my trauma treatment and doing the EMDR and continuing with tapping. And what I also started to recognize is what I would have always considered like a dormant PTSD that was there but didn't
Mhm.
affect my life, that my kids and a challenged marriage really started to affect me. And I had to start to learn, how do I cope with this? What are these things all about? Because what I realized is that I had created a world that I could completely control, similar to
Mhm.
telling my dad I didn't want to talk to him anymore if he wouldn't apologize. Like I had created
Mhm.
a world.
Yes, you had these systems created
Hmm.
so you could kind of control some of the outcomes and have some control or
Yeah,
semblance of control. Yeah, but I think that you were functioning like that because you were in this hyperdrive, right? There's just always so much happening in your
yeah,
life around you.
yeah. So
Mhm.
totally. So it was like this whole thing. And as every parent knows, kids are the last thing you have any control over, like in terms of what happens and how they do things and when they do them and
Mhm.
all those things. So you combine
Right.
that with a challenged marriage that I also couldn't control. And
Mhm.
suddenly I had all these things in my life that were not within these walls that I had built, and I had
Mhm.
to learn how to actually deal with things and how to work my way through them. I started having panic attacks that I had never had before, and I
Mm.
hated that. And that was a huge thing for me where I was like, I need to fix this. I can't have these. So it was really
Right.
about, how do I change my response to some of these triggers? So I started
Mm.
to identify the things that would trigger me. If there was an event that I wasn't invited to, or holidays were always really hard because I didn't have parents. I always found that because I was so independent and never asked for help, that if I did ask for help and somebody didn't help me,
Mhm.
that would really set me off because I never asked
Right.
for help. So if I actually got to the point when I said I need help and then people didn't
Then you had this
respond,
expectation. Right,
yeah,
because 'cause you're like, "I don't ask for it very often, and so if I'm asking, you're supposed to know, like, that's a big thing."
100%. I just had always treated people exceptionally well because, and again, I don't
Mhm.
know if I would have done that whether I had the life I had or not, but I
Mhm.
always say, just be a good human. Like I just really
Right.
believe that people should be good to people. And but
Right,
again,
and you expected that people would do that for you too, right? It's like, if I'm
yeah,
being exceptional to others, they need to be exceptional back to me. Or isn't that just the norm? Like, why wouldn't you?
Why
So
wouldn't
there's
you?
all those pieces. Yeah.
Yeah, so those were the
Mhm.
things that I really struggled with, is that I really did hold people to the same expectation that I held myself to. And I had to learn that
Mhm.
that's definitely not okay, because
Mhm.
most people don't function at that level. And
Yeah,
so
right.
it was really sort of learning through those things. Like, I think about myself as a leader, and in my early
Mhm.
30s leading large teams, and I was awful with empathy. It was terrible
Right,
because, again, I had this like suck it up attitude, because I was like, you
right.
can do it, suck it up, like we can do anything."
So let me ask you, when did you really let yourself into the concept that you can't actually control everything? When did that really sink in for you?
I would say it really sunk in probably 4 or 5 years ago. I would say it
Okay.
hit me the most. So my daughter has some mental health challenges, and I think
Mhm.
when that started, that was the
Mhm.
really big piece where I was like, I have no control over this. I have zero
Mm.
control over this. It was when I had my first panic attack, and it is also when
Mhm.
I realized I need to really change this. I had started to already make the changes in my work life and in my leadership life. But
Right.
at that point, I hadn't
Not as a mom, not as a
really done it in my
parent.
personal.
Right. Okay. And so it sounds like you started to reprogram the relationships slowly, slowly with your work life and then your personal life. I imagine that you would have started to shift the expectations that you had with people or that you allowed people to have with you. Were the transitions tough?
Yeah, you know what? They were hard because
Yeah.
I almost had to reteach people how to treat me. I'm a really
Mhm.
firm
Mhm.
believer that people treat you the way you allow them to. And
Mhm.
I had been the person who would do everything for anybody who needed it. I would always help. I would always go out of my way. I would always do all these things, and
Mhm.
never asked for much in return. And I started
Mhm.
to ask for people to treat me as I treated them. And that was hard. I definitely lost some friendships. I
Mhm.
left my marriage. And it's still hard for me because I definitely have challenges around loss,
Yeah.
which I think makes sense given everything. And I struggled with boundaries, because when I
Mhm.
would put those boundaries around my relationship, my fear was always that I would lose the people if I put those boundaries. So for a lot of years, I didn't. So when I started to put the boundaries in place, and then I did lose some people, it was really hard to keep putting the boundaries in place,
Mm.
because I was fearful that, what if I lost everybody? What if everybody left? Obviously, that's a pretty big irrational thought, that you can have the middle ground
Mhm.
there. But that was a challenge that I had to keep pushing through and continue to set the
Mhm.
boundaries. And I have to realize that I can't help everybody all the time.
Exactly. Wow. What a journey so far.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Melissa, what is your key message to the listeners of our show? What do you want them to know?
I kind of have a few values that I live by in both
Mhm.
my leadership life, my work life, and my personal life. And I would
Mhm.
say one of them is, my default answer to almost everything is, we'll figure it out. And I didn't realize how often I said it until my team started saying it back to me. You can always figure stuff out. It might not go the way you expect it to go. It might not go perfectly, but
Mhm.
you can figure it out. I think that's a big
Mhm.
one for me. Ownership is another big one. Like, I really, sometimes I confuse people in the workplace, because I have looked at many of my employees over the years and gone, if you're not happy coming here every day, you probably shouldn't. Because I don't understand why people would get up every day and do something that they hate. I'm like, do something that makes you happy. If you hate it that much, you shouldn't come in. And
Right. Right.
and so I really have a high expectation around people taking ownership of their
Mhm.
stuff. And I think the
Mhm.
biggest piece is the power of labels. I
Mm.
was so determined not to be a victim that it actually held me back. And I think we label things too often and don't understand the power of whether it's putting a word on something or not putting a word on something, and what that can do.
Right. Those are really great messages and amazing values to be reminded of. So, Melissa, I'm curious about if there was something that's been game changing for you in terms of inspiration that reflects your untold story. So, would you have a recall for like a quote, a mantra, a book, an event, a person, a speaker, something, anything that really speaks to the inspiration that kind of helped you pivot?
Yeah, I think like if we think about the "we'll figure it out," when Marie Forleo first came out and she started to say everything is figure outable, I was like, "Ooh, we're like soul sisters," and I loved
Mhm,
it. And she learned it from her mom, and so
mhm,
she has a sort of a longer version of that quote. That's no matter what you're feeling, you have what it takes to figure anything out and become the person you're meant to be.
mm.
I just think there's so much power in that.
Say the quote again.
No matter what you're feeling, you have what it takes to figure anything out and become the person you're meant to be.
Mm, yes, amazing.
Yeah.
Such a good quote. And so, what would you say is a cause or an organization that has been impactful to you on your journey that you would like to give a shout out to?
I think if I look back, my mom spent most of her time when she was sick at Princess Margaret in Toronto and in the cancer center there, and they did a lot for us. And so I really think they were a big piece for us. And I would say one of the other things for me, especially prior to 5 years ago, I've been kind of seeing the same therapist since then, is I had access to my therapy through an employee assistance program at work. And I
Okay.
think it's an underused resource that people probably
Hmm.
don't realize what they could get out of it. And it doesn't offer long-term therapy. So I ended up seeing people sometimes in short periods of time or not forever, but in our world right now where access to mental health support and mental health care is so hard, I think just
Hmm.
really knowing your resources and having access to things and seeing what you have access to is so, so critical right now because I didn't have the money to pay for it. So
Right.
there are resources that can help people get access. And so I'm a big advocate of making sure people see where these resources are and trying to drive the message out about all the different resources that exist, because I think too often people choose not to get help because they don't think it's within their financial means to do so.
Hmm. Oh yeah, employee assistance programs is really helpful. They're a wealth of resource, and it's at least a starting point for people to at least navigate through what is good for them and what is a good fit, even if they do have to venture out beyond the EAP programs afterwards. But it's a really good starting point for a lot of people, and I do know that there are many people who use the programs, but there's a lot of people who don't know about them. So it's great that you're able to mention, like, not just but the importance, the impact it had for you and how it led you in a big part of your healing journey.
Yeah, it was an EAP therapist who started me on EMDR and tapping. Like that's where I met
Hmm.
her through. I stayed with her longer than that, but that's where I met her through.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's a good way to get connected. And so, Melissa, how are you findable? If people would like to connect with you, what platforms can we find you on?
I'm everywhere. Uh, so
Everywhere.
um, my website is www.happyleader.ca. And then
Hmm.
most of my handles are similar. So on Instagram, I'm at the Happy Leader. On Twitter, I am at Happy Leader One. I'm still looking for the original Happy Leader. And and on Facebook, Happy Leader Enterprises has a Facebook page, but I'm also on Facebook just as Melissa Maloney, and
Hmm.
on LinkedIn as well as Melissa Maloney, or Hire Melissa Maloney is what my speaking page is.
Okay. Well, we're going to include all of the details on the show notes page that we're going to have for you, or that we do have for you. And so we've got your website, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, the works.
Yes.
Amazing. So, Melissa, guess what?
What?
You've just dared yourself to share. Congratulations.
Thank you. It was a very amazing experience.
I'm so glad to hear that you had that experience. And Melissa, I just want to acknowledge the perseverance and resiliency that I was able to hear in your sharing today. It has been both humbling and admirable to see how your courage and bravery to keep going led you to where you are today. And I also really appreciate that you were able to acknowledge not just some of the pain, but so much of the pain and hurt along the way. And that with trial and error, you created a style of coping that suited you. And then you entered into this lovely transformation and you've embodied this life journey as a gift of who you've become today. And that's really, truly encouraging. So thank you for your deep conversation and for all of the daring and sharing.
Thank you. If I can have one person have belief that they can get through whatever they're going through right now, then my story is that gift. My experience, I look at all of it as a gift and an opportunity to be where I am today. And if I can impact one person, then it makes it worth it.
Absolutely. And once again, Melissa, thank you for being part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.